Hey VC, I hope everyone's having a happy new year and had a fun New Year's Eve night last night if you went out and did anything or did anything at your house. So anyway, what I'm doing here today is a contest entry for Rockboy680 James Lack's contest, which runs through I'm not sure when it ends, sometime this month, but anyway, it's his 2,000 subscriber contest, which congratulations on that, James, well deserved. So pretty straightforward and simple on the rules. He wants you to pick at least 3 decades. You can go as many as you want, I guess, but at least 3 decades in a row, and show and name your favorite album from those decades. So like the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, whatever, or 70s to now, or 50s to now. So yeah, which was incredibly hard in some cases to narrow down to just one album, but some cases it wasn't so hard. So I started with the 50s and I'm going up through the 80s. So for the 50s, I go with Little Richard's debut. Not a bad song on here. You can see the track listing. Some of the songs you might not be familiar with, but the hits, of course, Tutti Frutti and Ready Teddy and Rip It Up, everyone knows, but some of the other things on here is really not a bad track on this album, which is a surprise because the 50s was generally albums were hit singles with just kind of padded out with filler in the most for the most part, with the exception of some albums like some of the stuff Sinatra was doing and some of the jazz albums. It was tempted to pick a Sinatra album. I was tempted to pick something jazz like Miles Davis or Coltrane, but rock and roll's always been first in my heart, so I went with that. And this just epitomizes the kind of this is the blueprint for early rock and roll. It just everything on here just jumps right off the record. It's exciting, it's brash, it's fun, it's wild, it's great and crazy, and not a bad song on here. I think of the early rock and rollers that Little Richard was probably the best of the bunch. He was innovative and all. Of course, Chuck Berry was too, but I think both of them were more talented and innovative than Elvis was, even though I like a lot of the early Elvis songs. Chuck Berry, not Chuck Berry, but Buddy Holly would be right in there too. I almost thought about picking a Buddy Holly record, which I don't have anything by him except a couple of things on CD. But yeah, I mean, this is just you can't beat this, and this sounds as wild and crazy and fresh today as it did back in 1950, 50 whatever, whenever it came out. So yeah, he's just that's a great one, and there's quite a few great 50s records, but that would probably be top of the list for me. Um, so there's that, yeah. And I think yeah, well, there's that. The 60s, this is almost boring at this point, going to come as no surprise. Beatles' second album, which really isn't even a true album at all. This is one of Capitol's Hatchet Job, Frankenstein albums. But for all that, there's not a bad song on here. This is their rock and roll soul album. Just like the Little Richard album, it's just full of action packed and full of excitement. Everything just jumps off the record. This is I would love to have been, you know, I was like 0 or 1 or whatever when this thing came out, but would have been great to have been 14 or 15 or whatever, and when this came out, go down to Woolworths or the record store and pick this up. And I just love the early Beatles. I love they're my favorite band, of course, so I love all of their whole history there. But I love the early Beatles best, I think, even though I do love the White Album and all that good stuff. But this is just when they're, you know, I mean, I guess you could go with Please Please Me, which is another album that I also love, but this is when they're young and kind of just starting, even though they'd been around for a little while at this point. But I mean, this is when they had just broken huge a year before in England and Europe, and they've just broken in America at this point. And so it's all still kind of had to have been exciting and wonderful and new and a little bit confusing to them at this point. But they deliver. I mean, later on you would hear about the sophomore jinx on bands that would have a great first album and their second album just wouldn't match up. And even though this isn't truly the Beatles' second album, it certainly matches up and then some. And this is my favorite album of all time, as I've said a million times on here. So obviously it's going to be my favorite of the 60s. And in a decade that was so rich in music, it's stands above everything else, which is a testament to my love of that album. So we get to the 70s, and again, this was harder than the first two decades because there's a lot of great soul music. There's some great solo Beatles stuff, Plastic Ono Band, All Things Must Pass, Ram, and all that. There's the Modern Lovers, and there's just quite a few great things. And of course, you had punk and new wave. But my favorite of the 70s, I could have just as easily picked London Calling, but this one edges it just a little bit, even though London Calling has a bit more variety on it than this one. But this would be it. This came out in 77, I think, so I would have been about 13. And I didn't actually hear this album till about 1981 or so, because they didn't play it on the radio. But it was real exciting. I did hear some other punk new wave stuff a little bit before that. And just 70s music, the stuff that was on the radio, I found extensively boring, and I still do. All the Kansas and Styx and Eagles and Boston and Fleetwood Mac and all that stuff, which I know those people have a lot of fans here, so I'm not trying to rain on anybody's parade. But for me, when I was a kid and to this day, Peter Frampton, and I just didn't like any of that stuff. And so thank God punk and new wave came along and gave music a good kick in the ass that it needed, because it had gotten pretty stead and boring, just like it is nowadays. Of course, probably worse nowadays than it was then, but because there was good stuff around in the early and mid 70s, it just, most of it didn't get a lot of radio play. Some did, David Bowie and stuff, but the Clash and the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and the Jam and the Squeeze and all those people made music fun and exciting again, and made it what it was supposed to be, at least in my thought process. I know a lot of people think that punk rock was silly and immature and stupid, and they would rather listen to prog rock albums with 50-minute songs on each side. And some of that stuff is good. I'm not knocking all of it, but as far as the commercial stuff, anyway, this just made with love, sealed with a kick, which is actually the catchphrase for London Calling, I think. Not this album, but this just goes a million miles an hour, and it's just angry and full of great guitar and songs, and just a brilliant album. So check it out if you haven't. My favorite album of the 70s. And then we go to the 80s, and this again is no surprise because I've shown this a million times. This is like my third favorite album of all time, and the Jam is my third favorite band of all time, and this is my favorite album by them, and this is from 1980. And of course there were a lot of great albums in the 80s too, so there was a lot to choose from, but those would be my 4 decades in a row. That takes us to the 90s, and I can't really think of anything that I would pick as album of the decade from the 90s, because that's probably the worst musical decade ever. I mean, I guess the 2 that have followed have been terrible too, but the 90s was just, there was very little good music, in my opinion, made in that decade, but we won't bother with that. So 4 albums, 4 decades. Hope that's what you were looking for, James, and good luck on the subscribers. Congratulations on 2,000. I'm sure you get a lot more. Check out Rockboy680 if you haven't subscribed or checked out his videos. He's got good stuff going on over there, and Happy New Year, everybody. We'll see you later.